What we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. T.S. Eliot. So, is today and this morning an ending or a beginning? Catherine mouthed both. It's both because it's always both. And what I talked about with Caleb just a few minutes ago is that for many of our children, school started this week. And so it was a beginning for them, which meant the end of their summer vacation. And we experience endings and beginnings so often in our lives that most of the time we don't even notice when they are happening. One blends into the other so often that we don't realize that our lives really are a series of ending and beginning. And for the most part, we just breeze through moment to moment, and we don't often remember to take that pause for the breath in between. And one of the books that we have our chaplain interns read every so often is a book called Transitions, Making Sense of Our Life Changes by William Bridges. And I believe I may have talked about this a little bit a year or so ago, but this book was originally published almost 50 years ago. But there's wisdom in the timelessness of the themes that he addresses. And his main premise is that as a culture, we haven't been taught how to move through the transitions in our lives, and that we don't understand the difference between a transition and a change. The difference between a transition and a change. And so Bridges writes, our society confuses them constantly, leading us to imagine that transition is just another word for change. But it isn't. Change is your move to a new city or your shift to a new job. It's the birth of your new baby or the death of your father. It is the switch from the old health plan at work to the new one, or the replacement of your manager by a new one, or it's the acquisition that your company just made. In other words, he says, change is situational. Transition, on the other hand, is psychological. It is not those events, but rather the inner reorientation and the self-redefinition that you have to go through in order to incorporate any of those changes into your life. I'm going to say that one more time. He writes, it is not those events, but rather the inner reorientation and self-redefinition that you have to go through in order to incorporate any of those changes into your life. Whatever word we use, he says, our society talks a lot about change, but it seldom deals with transition. Unfortunately for us, it is the transition that blindsides us and is often the source of our troubles. I'm going to say that one again too, and let us just think about that. We all experience change all the time, but he says, unfortunately for us, it is the transition, that inner psychology, that blindsides us and is the source of our troubles. It is thus no accident that people imagine that they can prepare for, say, retirement by making adequate financial preparations, choosing a good place to live, and developing some new interests. In those articles about retirement, you don't find anything about going through that 3-phase transition process that this book deals with, or how little getting all set for the change prepares you for the transition. Or how little getting all set for the change prepares you for the transition. So I just want us to think about that a moment in our own lives. How many of us have changes going on right now? I see a few hands going up. And so my invitation as I speak today is for you to think about those changes that are happening in your life. Are they just external changes, or are some of them leading into a sense of internal transformation? Just something to start thinking about. And so Bridges, in his book, what his book is really about is he goes on to explain that there are 3 elements that need to be acknowledged and explored in relation to transition. You have an ending, you have a neutral zone, and then you have a new beginning. That's kind of what I talked about with Caleb. First grade ended for him, and then he had summer vacation, and then he was ready to move into 2nd grade. And what happens, at least in our culture, is that so many times we have a tendency to rush from an ending into a new beginning without even acknowledging that something has ended. Or we will get so thrown off course and feel so lost when we enter into that neutral zone because we haven't recognized that we're in a neutral zone, that we may go into a depression or a midlife crisis because we don't know how to sit with or be in that transformational void, so to speak. And so his invitation is to begin to explore the concept that T.S. Eliot so eloquently wrote about, that the end is where we start from. The end is the beginning. And so I just want us to take a little bit of time for us today to think about that. And maybe we start with the endings. So if you really think about it, life is full of endings. And the key is to learn how to acknowledge them. And there is value in acknowledging our endings. That is why we have graduation ceremonies. That is why we have funerals and memorial services, because we have to acknowledge that something has ended. And sometimes the endings are drastic, like we experience the death of a loved one, or a divorce, or leaving a job, or changing careers. But sometimes the endings are more subtle, and this, many times, is where we get tripped up. Have you ever thought about it this way? There is an ending with the birth of a child. There are endings taking place during a wedding ceremony. There is an ending when we bring a new animal into the home. We tend to think of everything I just named as new beginnings, and we tend to view them as such. But if you really think about it, everything I just named, a wedding, a birth of a baby, bringing home a new animal, they are also beginnings, or they are also endings, because with the birth of a new baby comes the loss of just running to the store to buy some groceries. With the beginning of the new marriage comes the loss of just doing it my way. With the joy of bringing in a new puppy or kitten comes the end of the routine of being able to just leave the house whenever you want for a weekend with no pre-planning. And we've all done it. We've done it so many times that we don't even recognize it. Beginning and ending and ending and beginning, and they all just kind of blend into one another until we're just in this constant motion of this thing we called life. And then one day we just are exhausted and we feel like we have to crash, possibly because we never slowed down to stop, to reassess, and to figure out where we actually are in our never-ending cycle and patterns of beginning and ending. And you know what Bridges talks about, he says we have the ending, but then we have that neutral zone. And I think sometimes we forget to allow ourselves to go into that neutral zone. And if you think about it, that's what a butterfly is and a caterpillar, right? You have the caterpillar, he creates his little cocoon. That's the ending of that phase of his life. He goes into his chrysalis, he turns into a bunch of goo for a little while. And all of a sudden he reemerges as something totally different. But if he never gave himself that, as I call it, the goo period, he would never have been able to transform into a butterfly. You don't just go from a caterpillar to a butterfly overnight. You have to change, but you also have to transition. And my guess, I don't know what the consciousness of caterpillars and butterflies are, but there's probably a different understanding and a different consciousness of the caterpillar who is just having all his little legs going up and down the tree and the leaves, and this butterfly who's now flying away. And that's where the transition is that's that inner transition of the change of the consciousness that happens when we go from point A to point B, if we're allowing ourselves to take that breath in between and acknowledge the inner psychological transformation that is happening within that transition. And I remember I was talking to somebody about a year ago, and she was super, super excited that her son had just graduated from high school. And we were talking, and she was all excited, and she was saying, and I don't know what he's going to do next, and he doesn't have a plan, but I don't know. And I remember looking at her and just saying, let's just take a moment to celebrate the fact that he graduated, that this is a major accomplishment for the family and for the graduates. So let's acknowledge the ending. Let's take a pause and let there be a little bit of a neutral zone. And then there will be a new beginning when the time is right, after there has been a little bit of that internal transformation that needs to happen as a young adult transitions from being a teenager or a high school student into what it means internally, emotionally, psychologically, mentally, and consciously to enter into that new phase of becoming a young adult. We have to allow our children that transformation process. We have to allow that within ourselves too. And so that becomes the neutral zone. And I'm going through that a little bit right now because my parents are here today. I have no reason to cry, but it wouldn't be a Sunday if I did cry for no reason. But they're here, and they're here because Danny is turning 15 on Tuesday. Also another reason not to cry. But so it's kind of an ending. She's going, hopefully, if she passes her test, to get her driver's permit on Tuesday. Nathaniel turns 16 in March, and so he has his driver's license and his car. And they both moved into that change really quite easily. And I was talking about, well, Danny, I can still, like pick you up from school if you need me to. And she looked at me and she's like, why would you pick me up from school? I'm going home with him. And he was like, yeah, why would you pick her up from school? And I realized, well, it's just a change for them. They're super excited to like be independent. But for me, it's a little bit more of a transition, right? And I'm super proud of them, both of them. And there's a little bit of sadness because my role as mother, the way that I've been understanding it, is changing. But with that change is a little bit of a different understanding of consciousness for me. And the Danny is lobbying very, very hard for me to let go of the minivan because she does not want to learn to drive in the minivan. She and Nathaniel have easily decided to let go of the minivan. They think I should just change into another car, which, they don't understand the financial ramifications of that and everything. But I kind of like the minivan, right? I was sort of really excited to buy my first minivan when Nathaniel was like 6 months old and I was pregnant with Danny. Like that was a transition, a psychological transition time for me. And as Danny said a few months ago, and I was trying to explain this to her, and then she came back at me and she's like, so the only reason you want to keep the minivan is because me and Nathaniel sat in it? I'm like, well, when you put it that way, it might be time to get rid of the minivan. That she was just it was just so blunt because me and Nathaniel sat in the minivan. Well, yes, and maybe when you become a mother, you'll understand that having your children sit in the back of the minivan means something. But my point is that there's always this neutral zone. And it doesn't matter whether you're a first grader moving into second grade, whether you're a high school graduate taking some time to figure out what to do with your life after you graduate, or whether you're a mother going into a different phase of life with your teenage children. It is a recurring pattern. And we can all benefit from acknowledging it. And some transitions are larger and more meaningful than others. A lot of us, when we hit a new decade, that sometimes for some of us is a time to sit down, reflect, what does this past decade mean? What do I want to look forward to in the new decade? And I invite us, whether it's a decade or not, or just every so often, to really take the time and think about, am I in the middle of a transition? Have there been some endings that I didn't acknowledge? Are there some new beginnings that I'm looking forward to? And have I been willing to take the time to sit in the neutral zone? I shared a story a few years ago. I also have talked a little bit about the difference between you have a stimulus and a response, and then in the middle between the stimulus and the response, you have that breath in between. And that's a little bit the same thing, but I shared a while ago, I had a friend who has a husband who has a chronic illness, and his health is never, they never know from year to year how long he's going to be on this planet. And she was talking one time about how they were planning this vacation, and she was talking about all of the, you know, the plan A, the plan B, the plan C, if what should happen if he should die while they're on vacation, and what she's going to do, and all of this. And I finally just said, wait, stop, right? Stop. Let's just take a moment to pause and say that that's pretty significant, that you're having a conversation with me about what should happen if your husband dies while you're on vacation. We took a breath, we acknowledged that that was pretty significant, and then we moved on with the conversation, right? The whole thing only took about 3 seconds, but it was still significant. It still required us to stop, take a pause, and then start up again. And so that's just what I want us to think about a little bit today. Where in our own lives do we just need to acknowledge what's going on with us, take a pause to acknowledge it and be with it, even if it's only for a few seconds. This process doesn't have to take a long time. And then we start up and move forward again. And as we are coming out of, and I've been saying this for almost a year now, as we're coming out of a pandemic that comes and goes and then shows up again and then slows down again, start, pause. Who are we as a UUCGV community? Who are we as individuals? Who are we as partners, as parents, as friends? What is ending in our life? What is beginning? And where are we in the neutral zone? And if we're struggling with something in our lives, is it possibly because we're either grieving the ending of something we didn't realize was ending, we're a little bit fearful of something that may be beginning, or we're just not understanding or acknowledging the difference that comes with change versus transition. And so I think I'll just leave it at that for us to think about who we are with these endings, these neutral zones, and these new beginnings. And so with that, let us sing our closing hymn, What a Wonderful World. Or maybe we'll just listen.